Public housing is a lifeline for thousands of Massachusetts residents for whom the rising cost of housing has pushed other options out of reach. But for many, public housing also comes with a catch, including mice, mold, broken windows and doors. And in the Ruth Lillian Barclay apartments in Boston's South End last fall, the elevator was out for nearly 2 weeks, stranding disabled residents in their homes. It's why faith leaders are urging Beacon Hill to increase its public housing budget by nearly 75%, as the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization laid out in an open letter to state officials. I'm joined now by GBIO co-chairs, Reverend Stanfield and Phil Hillman, and State Senator Lydia Edwards. Thank you all so much for being here. So let's just talk about how this letter came about. I know you've been on this fight for a long time. Phil, if you want to kind of give a brief synopsis of what you laid out in the letter and what was kind of the impetus in putting it together.
Well, Burns is probably the better person to talk about the letter since he's one of the pastors who signed it.
And happy to say, so we've been working on it for a couple of years. We're concerned about housing because we operate out of the values of our different faith traditions and also the concerns that we hear from the people in the pews. And we have some legislation we're working on and really felt that it was time to add our clergy voices to the political work we do and put it in the mix. So the letter was created in a short period. We had over 150 signatories to it.
There have been some statewide efforts to increase housing stock just in the last couple of years. You know, what are you hoping that this contributes to that?
Well, the big push for the letter is to help get leadership, Senate and House leadership, to get the legislation through over the finish line, as we like to keep saying. And as you mentioned, it's been a deep campaign, a long campaign, and it was the time to get that over.
Senator Edwards, you recently wrote a piece in the Boston Globe emphasizing the need not just for more housing stock, but for equity to be emphasized. Can you talk about why that's important?
Well, I think it's really important that we take this moment and the funding that's coming through a bond bill, $4.1 billion, and say this is the time to build, but it's also a time to reflect on how we got here, that we don't have enough units for everybody, that they're incredibly unaffordable, that we have highly segregated, racially segregated housing, that we have lower homeowner rates amongst people of color. These weren't just accidents. There were policy decisions made by political people many years ago to implement redlining, to refuse to allow for multifamily zoning, to decide that some people will be close to work and others will be making a 2-3 hour commute. All of these were conscious decisions. And I think as we go to build a better future, we have to do so with an eye towards equity.
Right. In 2022, 177 MBTA communities, so communities within the zoning of the MBTA, were required to comply with new zoning regulations to build more housing. There's been a ton of pushback about that, right? And not just from communities that have said that they will not be able to, but my colleague Sarah Betancourt recently wrote a piece about how the infrastructure of some of these communities, leaders there fear that they will not be able to deal with things like the sewage systems, right? By building more multifamily housing, that it will overwhelm the existing infrastructure in their communities. Have you come up in this? I mean, has the state come up against speed bumps like that, and how are those kind of smaller, detailed issues being approached?
So I want to be very clear that the MBTA laws that people are oftentimes concerned about are planning laws. They're requiring that the city and town plan for additional units. There's no requirement that they start building them immediately. There's also not a lot of funding necessarily. We're working on it with the bond bill for them to be able to put shovels in the dirt. So it's really a matter of an exercise for cities and towns to imagine and vision together some more density in certain areas of their communities. That's the first and foremost. And then in terms of the resources necessary, I actually think that's going to really push them to engage in a back and forth with the state, saying, okay, we've done our part. We planned a certain way, but there are certain resources we need in order for this vision to come to fruition. We need the money. We need the infrastructure dollars. We need we need to make sure that we have more Chapter 97 funding for our schools. We need to make sure that we have all of these things in order to make sure this vision comes to fruition. So I actually think this is a first step. this is not a moment where we should be saying no, but more, how can we come together to do and build that, to do right and build that future?
Right, and as these issues come up, I think the attitude, right, has to be, okay, well, how can we overcome them, right? Because these individual communities are asking for more resources. In the letter, you talked about, Phil, this Affordable Homes Act, right, which is, I wouldn't say it's been passed through various committees. It would give $4.1 billion towards the creation of more housing. What is kind of your goal with that? I know that's a big push in the letter as well.
Well, there are two major pieces that have been a part of our campaign from the beginning. One is the public housing piece, where it's $1.6 billion for public housing. And this is to go after years of deferred maintenance. And that's why you need such a large number. The other piece has been the revenue generation side, which is the real estate transfer fee. We're in a housing crisis. And at the end of the day, we've got to build more units. And if we're not building more units, then you're not going to impact this crisis. And the question comes up, where does the revenue come from? And the real estate transfer fee is an opportunity for towns as a local option. They can choose to opt in or opt out, but an opportunity for them to raise revenue that then goes into an affordable housing trust. You can use that trust for first-time home buyers. You can use that trust to invest in more affordable housing. So these are the things that I think we need to really look at if we're going to take the tools and apply them to a crisis that we're in.
A recent Boston Foundation report found that rates of homelessness and those in Massachusetts residents who are at risk of homelessness, that those numbers have been skyrocketing. They do a point-in-time count. The National Housing and Urban Development Department, and I think last year in 2023 there was a total number of individuals, and I think this is, again, a point-in-time count of just over 19,000, and around 13,000 of those were families. I think what happens here if we don't build this, right? Like, what happens if we don't accommodate this crisis when so many people are on the brink of becoming homeless?
Well, we're seeing some of that with the current crisis. And of course, there are important things to do through direct service right now with that crisis. A lot of our institutions, we're 50-some institutions, churches, synagogues, etc. A lot of us are doing that in our own communities. Shelter, food. We have a bed set up in our church to accommodate a family if needed. But we need something systemic, and that's what we're thinking of right now. We focus on public housing because these are resources. It is a precious resource that the state already owns, but in many cases cannot use because we haven't taken care of it. Right. So the bond bill is, let's take care of this, which is one piece of a bigger puzzle, of course, but it's a really important piece.
Right. I mean, the infrastructure that we have that exists beyond just producing new housing is falling apart. I'm wondering what you're hearing. You mentioned earlier from the clergy and from the people in your communities and the people who you see at church. What are you hearing from them about their housing conditions?
One of the big issues is the ability to lose this dream of owning a home one day. I'm so busy paying rent that I can't envision saving the kind of money that's necessary to buy a home here in Massachusetts. And I think one of the downsides of what we're going to see is people leaving Massachusetts to go to other places, simply because they want to own a home one day. That's still a dream for many people, the dream of home ownership and the wealth that you can start to build having a home as an opportunity.
And I will say that just this morning, a few hours ago, I heard from a parishioner, and the landlord is selling. She's petrified that she can't stay in our neighborhood, and she has a decent middle income, and she takes care of 2 kids, and her mother lives with her, and she is now petrified that she will not find a place in our neighborhood in South Boston or in Boston, and her children are in Boston public schools, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very real issue for pastors and everybody day to day.
Yeah. Senator Edwards, you are the chair of the Senate Housing Committee. You talked about how we got here. Where do we go? Where do we go from here? How do we ameliorate this immediately?
Well, I think that there's been several major steps that the state house has made, the state legislature has made with Governor Baker with the MBTA laws. That was one, in lowering the threshold to allow for multifamily zoning. And also now we have funding with the bond bill. We also have a lot of policies, as mentioned previously. There's a transfer fee. There's ADUs as of right. There's a lot to do. About, say, 25 pieces of legislation are attached to the funding. So where do we go from here is we learned the lessons that we should have learned when it came to how we got here, as I mentioned, with redlining, as I mentioned, with the racial wealth gap. All of those different things are footprints for us to say, if we're going to go forward and we're going to invest $4.1 billion, it's going to be for a future that's more integrated, that's more equitable, and a future where the dream of home ownership is not dead. And that's what we need to be guided by.
Great. Senator Lydia Edwards, Phil Hillman, and Reverend Stanfield, thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.